Today, we turn our attention to the dispute over the Rambam's works that took place in Europe around the year 1232. The controversy revolved around Rambam's Moreh, Nevuchim and Sefer Hamada, and it culminated in these works being banned and eventually burned. What was it about these works that were so controversial? What social factors led to the appalling book burnings? Who was responsible for this? Indeed, some of the greatest rabbis of the day were involved in this story. So by delving into their writings, we hope to disentangle fact from fiction and learn about the central themes that emerge from this dispute. Today's story begins in the summer of 1332. We're going to Saragossa in Spain, and we have over there the leaders of the Jewish community, 11 members, manhigim, not rabbanim, but the leaders of the community, who send out a letter to all of the other cities that have Jews residing there in their area, which is the Kingdom of Aragon. So let's read from this letter. It says as follows, in part, Va'ata kamu shloisha chorshe mashchis. Now we have 3 tools of destruction that have arisen. In other words, there are 3 bad people. V'hei meisisim es ha'am, and they are having a negative influence on the Jewish community. Uledaber saros al harav haniskar, and they're talking slander, negativity against the Rambam. Ad asher echrimu kol hakoire b'sefer Hamada omer Nevuchim. In fact, they excommunicated anyone who studies or reads the Sefer Hamada, the first work of Mishnah Torah, whose completion we're celebrating tonight, and the Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. In addition, they also excommunicated anyone who learns any secular subjects. At this time, secular subjects meant the medieval philosophy, which was basically Greek philosophy. And the claim being made here is that certain unnamed individuals have, at least up to now they haven't been named, have issued a ban both against the Rambam's works and against studying secular philosophy. So we tremble when we hear this. And so therefore we're writing this to all of the communities in the Kingdom of Aragon, to go out and to fight a war, and to issue a counter ban. That is to put these individuals into a cherem. Kasher asinu anachnu, just as we did, kahal Saragossa. Sheichramnu v'nadenu, we put them in cherem and nidui. And here he says the names. Number 1 is Shloima Avram Hashoichen Bahar. Shloima, the son of Avram, who dwells on a mountain. What does it mean he dwells on a mountain? So in the south of France, in the area of Provence, there is a city called Montpellier, and this, obviously, the beginning of that word is M-O-N-T, is mount, which means a mountain. And so the Jews would often refer to people who came from there as Hashoichen Bahar. So he's from Montpellier in southern France. This is Shlomo ben Reb Avram. As going to become clear from the sources that we're going to look at, as well as from other sources, this was a well-known rabbinic figure who was highly respected by his peers and is quoted in Shuvah Svarim and Halacha Svarim, etc. He's number 1. And Shnei Talmid of 2 of his students. One name is Reb David, who we're not going to focus much on tonight. The second one is, he's named here as Yoina. This Yoina here, we also know from the different sources from this period, that this Yoina is referring to none other than the Rabbeinu Yoina. You learned Maseches Baba Basra, perhaps you remember that you were learning the Aliyos to Rabbeinu Yoina. That is because it's, instead of being called Chidushim, they're called Aliyas, because he writes at the end of each piece, Allah biyadenu. In other words, what is our conclusion? And so I got the name Aliyas to Rabbeinu Yoina. And he also wrote a Musar Sefer called Sharei Tshuva, and he was one of the very prominent Rishonim in Sfard. At this point, in the 1330s, he didn't reach his full prominence yet. That's going to happen a little later. But he too, together with his colleague and together with his teacher, Reb Shlomo, are being excommunicated by these 11 leaders of the Jewish community of Saragossa, and it signs off Nichtav B'Yerach of Shnas Dalid Tov Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis. It is signed in the summer, the month of the year 1332. This is a really important document because many of the documents that we're going to be looking at do not have dates on them. Because they don't have dates on them, it gets very confusing to try to figure out when things happened. This is one of the only documents in this whole parsha. A lot have survived, but this is one of the only ones that has its date, and that's why it's very useful in order to understand what happened. Okay, the first signatory of this document, his name was Bechaya ben Moshe. Bechaya ben Moshe is a known figure of this time. He was what we call a court Jew. Very close with James I, who was the king of Aragon at the time, and a very influential person in the community. And obviously, he felt very passionate about learning secular subjects. He also felt very passionate about defending the Rambam's honor, and so he is the instigator behind this letter, which is why he is the one to sign first. Okay, so this is scene 1 that we get, and now let's move to scene 2. We're going to read that Ramban at this time was about 38 years old, and the Ramban was living in Catalonia, in a region not too far from where we're talking about. Today it's all in Spain. And the Ramban writes a letter to the Rabbanim in France, and we'll gain some important information from the few lines that we'll read in this letter. The Ramban writes, Kol Eretz Tzarfas Rabbanim Vesarim, Kulam Iskimu Lenados Ulahacharim, Kol Ish, Asher Yodoi Heirim Lahagos B'Sefer Moreh Nevuchim V'Sefer Hamada. The Ramban writes over here that all of the rabbis of Tzarfas, all of the rabbis in France, have all agreed to excommunicate anyone who studies the Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Hamada. This is giving us information that we didn't get from the first letter in Saragossa. The first letter in Saragossa just said there's these 3 bad actors, Reb Shlomo and his 2 students, and they banned anyone who reads Sefer Hamada and Moreh Nevuchim. Here we're seeing from the letter of the Ramban that in fact the ban was, the excommunication was issued by the Chachmei Tzarfas. At this time, we're still in the era of the Balei HaTosfos. The era of the Balei HaTosfos, the 1100s and the 1200s. So we're in the 2nd century of the Balei HaTosfos. There's Balei HaTosfos in Germany. There's a Balei HaTosfos in France. Here we're talking specifically about the rabbis in France. And what we're learning from the Ramban is that all of the French rabbis were the ones who, in fact, issued this excommunication. Ad asher yigonzu gnizoi lamis. And they said that these books, meaning the Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Hamada, shouldn't be studied, but have to be buried away. And he says the Ramban is writing to the rabbis in France, and he writes, this is a summary of everything that you wrote. Unfortunately, the letter that the Rabbanim in France wrote does not survive. So we only have it a second account where here the Ramban says this is a summary of what you wrote. And then he tells us another thing that they wrote. You said about the holy individual, meaning the Rambam, he's b'chol galus Tzarfas v'Sfard lo yikam kamoyu, and no one, not by us here in Spain where we are, Ramban is saying, and not by you in Tzarfas, do we have anyone who is as holy as this person. Lo yikam kamoyu. Rambam is an unparalleled figure, and nonetheless, pa'artem peh libli chak, you irreverently spoke about him. Ba'amrechem, saying, yesh lanu gadol mimenu shanasa tzeduki. It seems that in the letter that came from France, there was this phrase that said, not such a big deal to say that you had a great rabbi who then went wayward. Why? Because we have a Gemara in Brachas, Yesh lanu gadol mimenu shanasa tzeduki, meaning this is a reference to the Gemara in Brachas that says it was Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who was obviously a tzaddik, he was a Kohen Gadol, and nonetheless he became a tzeduki after many, many years serving in the Beis HaMikdash. And so if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone, and it seems that the Rabbanim in France use this type of language in their document, which again, no longer exists today. So that's piece number 2 of this story. However, as we're going to see, things got a lot worse. And this is going to come to us from a letter that was written by the Radak. The Radak is a very familiar name, Reb David Kimchi, because he's living at this time, he lives in Provence, meaning not in Montpellier, but in the general area, not too far from there. And he is a very strong supporter of the Rambam. And during this period, from the letter that we're going to be reading right now, it's very clear that he left his hometown, traveled into Spain, and it seems when he was there, he was getting involved and trying to do something very similar to the first text that we saw. The first text that we saw was the leadership of the Saragossa community trying to get a counterban against Reb Shlomo and his two students. It seems that Reb Dak was trying to do the same thing in a different area of Spain, in Castile, where he was traveling. And so to that effect, the Radak, Reb David Chimchi, has a letter that is written to a man named Reb Yehuda ben Yosef al-Facher, and in this letter he writes as follows. Ki yatsa letarbus ra'a. He's writing about Reb Shlomo. He really went bad. V'hishchis darko, he became corrupt. V'nasa malshin u'moiser, and he levels an accusation which is probably the worst accusation you could come to a Jew, definitely at that time, in the 13th century. And what's the worst thing you could tell a Yid is that you're a malshin and a moiser, which means you went to the secular authorities and you reported on something that was going on in the Jewish community in a way that jeopardized the integrity of the Jewish community. What happened? So the Radak continues to say, when he saw that the French rabbis abandoned him. This likely means that although we saw that the French rabbis issued a cherem, this seems to mean that at a certain point they revoked their cherem, and indeed other letters from this period do show that at a certain point they revoked their cherem. So Radak is saying that when the French rabbis revoked their cherem, v'hushav ad apsilim, so what he's going to do now? If you don't have the French rabbis helping you out, so what did he do? He resorted to the psilim tavai dazara. What does that mean? He went to the barefoot Franciscans. These are a certain form of a Christian order, and they were mahader and not wearing shoes as a way of being more spiritual. And they were supposed to be mendicants, which means they're supposed to be impoverished. They're not supposed to live a life of luxury. So he went to them. And these were the people who very often were behind religious revival. They were behind the Inquisitions. They were behind these types of moistus that would deal with these types of things. And he said, look, my fellow Jews are all heretics, or most of them are heretics, because they follow the words of Rabbeinu Moshe and Mitzrayim, who wrote Sifrei Minus. Wow. So therefore, he continues, again, he's putting words into Reb Shlomo's mouth, saying, you get rid of your heretics, right? The Christians would, if they had someone who broke off or started another sect or had a belief that wasn't proper, so in the Middle Ages, that person would be dealt with quite harshly. So, Ba'aru eshalanu, why don't you do the same thing for us? And I'm telling you that you should command that we should burn these books. Which books? Sefer Hamada and Sefer Moreh. But he wasn't happy with this. He then went to the Franciscans, to the Dominicans. This is another order. And here he gives a Spanish word which means preachers, because these were known as the preachers. And then he went to higher priests and bishops. Cardinals. So this went really all the way up the Catholic hierarchy, all the way up to the top. All the Jews in Montpellier and other areas in Provence are now in danger because of this malshinus that Reb Shlomo has done. And so therefore, Radak concludes his letter to this Reb Yehuda ben Yosef, who is a communal leader in Castile, saying, you should have compassion and take pity on God and, so to speak, and on the Jewish people. You should issue a counterban against these people. And he signs his name, David ben Reb Yosef Kimchi. You'll notice that in this letter there is no mention about an actual fire, an actual burning of the books. There is a mention here that Reb Shlomo went to them and said, this is something that you should do. But for whatever reason, in this particular letter, there is no reference of that. However, there are other documents from this period in time that do indeed give us that missing link and talk to us about a fire, about a burning of the books. And this comes to us from a letter written by none other than the Rambam's son. The Rambam had one son that we know of. His name was Reb Avram, and he was Mamala Makim. He took the position of his father after his father passed away in Egypt. And he gets the news of this sometime in the 1230s. And he writes a letter responding, defending his father and attacking those who are against his work. The beginning of his letter opens with the following poem. Reads as follows: Ma baru, how foolish ha'omrim, those who say ki baru divrei chamudos, that they burnt. There's a play on the word baru. First one means foolish, second one means burnt. That they burnt divrei chamudos, the holy words, the pure words. Yikaru mizav, more pure than gold. Eish oich lahema. It's Torah, and Torah is fire. The eich eish toichlem. So how could fire consume? Fire can't consume fire. So fire can't consume the works of my Father. Binu lezois bairim. Fools, understand this. V'oizrei rav, and those of you who help nonsense or idolatry or whatever. Ein zeh, what you think happened didn't happen. Avol alu k'moi tishbi lekel ba'esh. These, the works of the Rambam went up like Eliyahu alive to Hashem in fire. Uchamalach b'soich halav, and like the angel who goes up in the story of Shimshon. His parents, who goes up again alive in a flame. That's the type of fire that happened over here. Very poetic, but in a sense, if you want to go very kipshutai, you think you're going to burn the works of the Rambam, you think that's going to be effective, it's going to be completely ineffective. They're going to be learning the works of the Rambam 7 centuries and 8 centuries later, which is exactly what's happening. And so these works are indestructible. Okay, by the way, here's a good point to pause and to say the following. All of these documents existed where Jews preserved them. And they wrote them down, and they used to have like these booklets that was collections of these letters, and there were different ones. And slowly these things were printed. The first major printing of these letters was in the 1500s, and then multiple times they were printed. So there's 2 major works today that have collections of these letters. One is a Sefer that's called the Geras Kna'is, that is one collection, and the other is called, what's the other one? The other one is called Ginzei Nistaris. Both of those particular editions were printed in the 19th century. That's where we have most of these documents. That's where we have most of these documents from. The bottom line is, we have here a story. We have here the story and the voices of the 3 individuals that we so far, the 4 individuals that we so far saw. We saw the community in Saragossa saying, they put a cherem on us, and we need to do a counter cherem. And they spoke against the Rambam, how terrible that is. We see the Ramban clarifying for us, actually the cherem was issued by the rabbis in France, so the rabbis of France are now part of this story. We see the Radak telling us that when the rabbis in France no longer supported Reb Shlomo, he went to the Christian authorities and asked that they be burnt, and then we find from Reb Avram, the Rambam, that the fire actually occurred. How many volumes, how many books, where did this fire take place? No information about that exists, but this is the story that we have as of now. Obviously a shocking story to hear that number 1, the Rambam's works were burnt. That's number 1 shocking. And number 2, the accusation that we hear from the Radak that Jews instigated this and were behind this, obviously makes it doubly shocking. So in order to understand what's happening here, we need a little more context. We're going to look now to 2 letters that were written during this period in time where people were saying against the Radak. And they were writing against the proponents of the Rambam and actually justifying what coming to Reb Shlomo's defense. So the first we're going to look at is a letter written by Reb Yehuda ben Yosef al-Fachar. He's the one, we mentioned his name a moment ago, Radak was writing to him before, trying to convince him that he should join the side against Reb Shlomo, and here we see that he's going to respond back. And what it is a pretty harsh attack on the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. Interesting, we're going to see he doesn't talk at all about the Sefer Hayat, he doesn't talk at all about Sefer Hamada. And in all the sources we've been seeing so far, we saw the Sefer Hamada is part of the ban, and is part of the agitation is against Sefer Hamada as well. He doesn't really talk about Sefer Hamada, he talks about Moreh Nevuchim. So let's have a look at what he writes to the Radak. So he writes as follows, Halo yadato im lo shamato. By the way, many of these letters are very hard to read because they're very poetic and they're imbued with a lot of biblical phraseology, which makes it very difficult. But we'll try our best and we'll summarize some outside. Halo yadato im lo shamato. Don't you know the Radak, he writes, Ki mixas divrei Moreh Nevuchim, that some of the words of the Moreh Nevuchim, not all, but some of the words of Moreh Nevuchim, Nevuchim ein ba'aretz, they're confusing. They cause people to be lost. And here he starts giving examples. The first example he gives the miracle that's described in Sefer Yeshua that's called Shemesh Begivon Doim. Bekitzer, the Maisa is that there was a war at this time, and Yeshua needs daylight in order to continue his battle to defeat the enemy, the Amorim who he is fighting. But the day is getting is concluding, and that's not going to be good. The enemy knows the terrain; they're going to be able to run away if it gets dark. And so we have where Yeshua turns to the sun and says, "Stand still," and that's what happens. And this is the miracle that's described in Sefer Yeshua. And good order. Seder Olam says that it's Gimel Tammuz, that this event happened on Gimel Tammuz. If we have time, we're going to come back to that and talk about that at the conclusion. So what happened? What's he talking about here? The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim has a passage about this. And as is known, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim often tries to minimize Nisim and try to minimize their role in Jewish life. It's a very vague passage. And so the commentators of the Moreh Nevuchim are themselves not sure what the Rambam really means there. But suffice it to say that definitely some of them say that the Rambam is explaining that the Nes wasn't literal, but in some metaphoric way. So for example, a metaphoric meaning would be that the Jews won their battle so quickly that it looked like, oh, no, the sun has been standing still because they achieved the victory so quickly. Again, not clear at all that that's what the Rambam is saying. The commentators hundreds of years ago already started debating it, but he here mentions this as problem number one. Problem number two is the story of the Asain, and that is the story of Bilam, where the Rambam lays out a principle. He says at any time you see a malach, it's always in a chizayin, it's always a vision, it's always a dream. You never see a malach sitting face to face with you in a physical form. That's not something. A malach is a spiritual being. You can't physically see a spiritual being, so therefore it's always in a chizayin. This is Rambam Shitta or Moreh Nevuchim, and he uses that as the second. And so therefore, when the donkey says, "I saw an angel," and Bilam is communicating with the angel, all of this is actually not something that happens. It's something that happens in his dream. The third issue that he brings up, The third issue that he brings up is about the Livyasan. The Livyasan is one of the Su'udas that's going to be L'Asid Lavai. The Rambam, and this we just learned actually in Mishnah Torah, if you were paying close attention in Perek Ches, I think, of Hilchos Tshuva, he says over there that the Su'uda is a mashal. The whole Su'uda, L'Asid Lavai, is a mashal. Olam Haba is a soul without a body. And it's a very good thing. And so one of the words that Chazal use is Suda. Now, if that's Suda, so therefore the Livyasan and the Sharabar are also part of the metaphor. The Ravid al-Asar got upset by that. And you may have noticed, he said, no, this is not correct. This is not correct according to Chazal. So that's the third item that he brings. And then he concludes this part by saying, any person who's a pious Jew, is very confused and shocked when they see something like this. Then he moves into the next area. There's a very famous passage of Moreh Nevuchim in Chelek Beis about Aristotle's static universe theory. That is as follows. Aristotle believed that the world is infinite, which means it was never created. It always existed. And by the way, science for many centuries said that. The Big Bang, by the way, is a change. The Big Bang tells you is the opposite of static universe theory. The Big Bang says that there was a beginning. Okay, but Aristotle had his way for many, many centuries, and so therefore, if you were woke in the 1300s, in the 1200s, so that means you had to believe in the static universe, and so obviously that goes against Bereshis bara Elikim es Hashmayim v'Haaretz. So the Rambam has a whole keta on this in Anerech Perek Chavav, I think, in Moreh Nevuchim Chelek Beis. And he writes over there, Aristotle doesn't have good rayas, and it's not a persuasive case, so you need to believe it. And so therefore, we're going to reject Aristotle on this, even though usually Rambam is very accommodating to Aristotle. However, he does write over there that if we could demonstrate, and we could prove 100% that the world was a static universe, so then I'd be open to reinterpreting Bereshis bara as a metaphor. Oh my God, this was very, very controversial to open up that type of can of worms and to say that type of thing. So this is what Rabbi Yehuda ben Yosef is quoting that part, and he's saying this is, how could anyone say something like this? And what the Rambam does is, it says, once it comes to, we say, God says, Nasa Adam b'tzalmeinu, our image. Is that literal? God has an image? No, it doesn't have an image. God doesn't have an image. So if you could work it out that way, that Salmeinu for God is not literal, so you could work it out for Bereshis bara Elikim. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Yosef wants to rip his hair out of his head. How can you compare the two? How can you compare? Obviously, the idea of saying that the Eibishter is not a physical body, yes, so therefore Salmeinu is a metaphor, fine. But to take the whole story of Bereshis and Shabbos and everything in the 6 days, and you're going to say all of that, he says this is something that should be rejected from the Beis Medrash. Rambam should have never said something like this. In fact, the word that often is used for proof in medieval philosophy is a moifis. A moifis means a clear, demonstrable proof. It's not to be confused with an experiment that's done today. That's not how it worked then. There, it just had to be logic. That logically you were able to make your argument and it was sound, so that was called a moifis. That's the word they always used. So Rabbi Yehuda does something geschmack. He says the Torah talks about what happens if a Navi comes and gives a moifis, that's a different meaning of the word, a miracle, and says, do avodah zarah. What do? You don't listen to the Navi. I don't care about his ois. Lo yisishma al divrei hanavi. You don't listen to his moifis. So he says same thing over here. Even if Aristotle will come with his moifis ahin, moifis aher, breishas bar elikim is breishas bar elikim. Then he moves to another controversial area of the Moreh Nevuchim, and that has to do with the long life that's ascribed to people in Sefer Bereshis. The Rambam minimizes that. How does he do that? In Moreh Nevuchim he writes that it's only the people who are named to have lived 900 years, 800 years, and 700 years, only those people, Shmam v'Shem Imam, Yankov ben Todris, only that person lived longer. But his cousin and his brother and all the people living around them, they live regular lives like us. The Pashtus, why is the Rambam doing that? Because the Rambam wants, it's a shocking miracle. People can live so long. According to the Moifis, the logic of medieval philosophy, it was impossible for a person to live 900 years. And so therefore, you minimize the miracle by saying it only applied to certain individuals. So he says, this is what a ridiculous thing. At the end of the day, the Rambam, you still need to accept that it happened to some people. So he says as follows. Imagine one person comes and says, I saw a camel flying in the air. You wouldn't believe it. What if someone says, I saw 2 camels flying in the air? So you wouldn't believe it either. Okay, so now would it make sense to say, 2 camels flying in the air, that I can't, but 1 I'm going to accept? It's ridiculous. The second you're ready to accept that 1 camel is flying in the air, so then it's not a bigger leap to accept that 2 are flying in the air. So either none of them live long, fine. But the second you accept that some people live long, so then you already have 1 camel flying in the air, so just believe that the second camel is flying in the air. And the Ramban, by the way, in his Pirush al Torah also criticizes this passage of Moreh Nevuchim as well. He then moves on and says as follows. B'chol zois. Look at the left-hand side. B'chol zois. Nonetheless, despite all these critiques I leveled at the Moreh Nevuchim, mitzvah aleinu lachos al kvoid shal Rabbeinu Moshe zal. We have to be concerned about his honor. Ki haya b'doyrei ki ish chamudas. He in his generation was a very pure person, using language that we say about Daniel. Who kasav es Mishnah Torah Sefer. He wrote the Mishnah Torah and he celebrated the Mishnah Torah. And he uses the Gemara in Chagiga over here that you're supposed to learn Torah from a Malach Hashem Tzvakis. We spoke about this in a previous class. So he says that's the Rambam. The Rambam is Malach Hashem Tzvakis. You got to learn from him. V'achar of loikam kamay. We never had anyone as good as him. And therefore we need to be done him lekaf schus ve'en lahar achim idosav. In other words, I reject this work, or parts of this work I reject, but that doesn't get in the way of the grandeur of this man, and the greatness of this man, and the holiness of this man. And we have to give him the benefit of the doubt. And at the same time, you're allowed to have hasagos and disagreements on these things that he did. And then he goes and says, but the people who were very loyal to the Rambam during this period, for them, the idea that the Rambam made an error is something off the table. So he says, it's not a big deal to think that the Rambam made an error. His lashon is, im chata chet echad. Don't worry, it's not upgefrekt to say that the Rambam chata chet echad. Why? And he brings 2 biblical rayos. One is from the story of Aaron and Miriam, where Aaron and Miriam turned to Moshe and say, Asher nayalnu v'asher chatanu, we were foolish and we sinned when we spoke about your wife. That's the story in Parshas Ba'aloischa. And then the story in David, when David HaMelech counted the Jewish people, which was the wrong thing to do. And then after that story, David HaMelech said, Hine anoichi chatasi, I sinned. And so therefore, if David HaMelech could, and Aaron could, and Miriam could, so it's the same thing we could say about Moshe Rabbeinu. It doesn't detract ki huzeh from how we look at Aaron, how we look at David, and in this case, how we look at the Rambam. So this was the letter that we saw from Yehuda Alfachar. Now we're going to see another letter, also written by a Jew in Castile. Again, the anti-Reb Shloimeh movement didn't really pick up so much in Castile as it did in Aragon. So here we have a Yid named Rabbi Yosef ben Tadras Halevi, and he's writing a letter to the Jews in Montpellier, where the action all happened. And we'll see a little bit of a different focus in the selection that I'm using from his letter. Here, he's going to talk more about the impact that he thinks the Moreh Nevuchim is having on society. Okay, so the Yehuda Alfachar's letter is academic problems with the Moreh. He didn't talk about the sociology at all. He did a little, but it wasn't the emphasis of his letter, and so therefore I didn't include it. Here's the other way around. Rabbi Yosef ben Tadris is going to talk a lot about the sociology of how all of this is impacting hearts and minds on the ground. So what does he say? He says as follows. There are people going around who say, Chachma matzanu, we're philosophers, we're wise. Li is called divrei Torah v'divrei Kabbalah. All of Torah and all of tradition is a mashal v'chida. All of tradition is one big metaphor. The Torah is one big metaphor. And about the miracles, la kamayim shoysim, they mock it. The toilen to'usam, and their error, they blame it on the Ba'ashli Rabbah, the great one. Who? Harav HaGadol Rabbeinu Moshe. Zatzal. So great respect here for the Rambam. Says over here, like Kam Kamoyu Mimois Ravina Veravashi. There hasn't been anyone as great as the Rambam from the time of Chsimas HaTalmud, Ravina Ravashi, till today. That's an amazing statement. But the problem is we have people here who are taking all of the miracles in the Torah and marginalizing them, and they're taking B'chlal details in the Torah and saying it's a metaphor, and that is a problem. V'im Rabbeinu Karei Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam called his work Moreh HaNevuchim. Ru'uyim anu likrois Nevuchas HaMorim. We should call it the opposite. Here is making a pun. Nevuchas HaMorim, meaning the confusion for the rebels. Morim are rebels. So Moreh HaNevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, turns into the confusion for the people who are rebelling. And then he goes on to say the following. I heard a rumor a number of years ago that the Rambam wanted to bury the third part of the Moreh Nevuchim. What's in the third part? One of the big themes in the third part of Moreh Nevuchim is the Rambam goes through the mitzvahs and offers reasons and rationales and justifications for many of the mitzvahs. Some of them intuitive. Many of them, when you read them, they are quite shocking. So for the example, Ketores is a good example. We spoke about this once in a previous class. Ketores, the Beis HaMikdash, has so many korbanos, so it smells. So you need to have a positive aroma. So you have Ketores there in order to expel the negative smell. That's an example. Or korbanos, even korbanos, about which the Torah says, Reach Nichayach LaHashem, the great avodah, and how Hashem so much appreciates it. There, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam explains that Jews couldn't envision serving God without animal sacrifice. And because this was the way of the idolaters. And had God said no animal sacrifice, they would have done it for Avodah Zarah. So therefore Hashem said, you know what? I'll channel it toward me. I'll channel it toward Avodas Hashem. And many other mitzvahs that as well, he gives reasons that are technical. Another interesting thing is many of them revolve around Avodah Zarah. So for example, you're not allowed to have a tattoo, and this you're able to see even when you're learning Sefer Hamada. You're not allowed to have a tattoo. That's linked with Avodah Zarah. Many of the beard and the payas mitzvahs are all part of his Hilchas Avodas Kachav Mazalis, and that's following the logic in the Moreh Nevuchim that all these things are to distance us from Avodah Zarah. Anyway, so he's saying over here that the Rambam himself regretted having produced this, and so he therefore said that he wants to bury it, but too late, the work is out, and once it's on the internet, you can never take it down. And this is what he's saying over here. Now, it's a very difficult thing to understand, or to even accept this, because Rabbi Avram ben Rambam endorses the third chelek of his Rambam's work, and because he spoke about this, that people have problems with it, and he said, if you don't like the reasons there, you don't have to accept it. But at no point did he say, oh yeah, by the way, my father also was unhappy with his work. So it's this is the only source we have for this. It's a certain tradition that he heard. But what's important is it tells us what was on his mind. That in it, he thought this was a problem. The Taimei HaMitzvos in the third section of Moreh Nevuchim was a problem. Why? And look what he says over here. He says, how do you think you understand the reasons for the mitzvahs? And your reason, this is upon an halachic term, tam lifgam. You're basically using a tam, not taste, but a reason, lifgam, to ruin the mitzvah. And then he goes on, he quotes a Gemara that Shlomo, the Gemara says, we don't reveal the reasons for mitzvahs. And it's a whole sugya, whether there are reasons for mitzvahs. We can't get into that now. But there is a Gemara that says, why didn't Hashem reveal the reasons for mitzvahs? Because then we're going to rationalize them away. Shlomo Melech did that. He said, you can't marry a non-Jewish wife because then she's going to lead you to idolatry. Okay, I won't do idolatry. And then, and etc. Okay. And then he says, V'yatza ha'egel hazeh. And the result, the sociological result, is we have the egel that we have today. That we have the Erev Rav, and we have the Asafsuf, we have the rabble, the masses. Everyone thinks he's a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, and pashtu yudeim be'ikr, and they're messing up the ikr, the Yiddishkeit. They're treating sanctified rituals as mundane things, and they think they're pturim min atfila or min atfilin. Interesting. He points to two things. Yidden saying, "I'm not putting on tefillin." Yidden saying, "I'm not going to daven." And by the way, according to Aristotle, prayer doesn't work, right? Because God, his conception of God doesn't allow for prayer, so we could understand how that type of thing works. And it's just bringing people down. It's not helping people. Okay? So in the first letter that we saw from Yehuda Al-Fachar, The stress there was all the problems with the Moreh, Nevuchim. Here we see Rabbi Yosef ben Tadras Halevi living in the same region, pointing and saying that we have a problem here. We have Jews who aren't taking their Yiddishkeit seriously. They're being lax in their observance of mitzvahs. They aren't taking the Torah seriously. They're issuing new interpretations of the Torah. And guess what? Everything is being blamed on who? On the Rambam, the Rambam, the Rambam. Why? Because you could go, the reasons, every mitzvah has a reason. If every mitzvah has a reason, it doesn't apply to me, right? Or if the Rambam says a metaphor about one thing, then maybe I could go ahead and expand it and say that even another thing is a metaphor. Where do you draw the line? And so therefore, the issues that we just are seeing here in the book have real life consequences in real life. And indeed, we have from another Eidos at this time, there's the Smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol was written by Moshe of Kutzi. The reason it's important to bring up his name, earlier I mentioned the rabbis of France, and all of the documents, not one of them ever mentioned which Rabbanim we're talking about. We know who the Rabbanim at the time in France are. Rabbi Yechiel Miparij is one of them, and Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi is another. For whatever reason, their names don't surface in these documents. But anyway, Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi, one of the greatest of Sarfas at this time, he actually goes down to Spain, and he describes in Asay Siman Gimel, where that he goes down to Spain in the year 1236. That's mamish right after the time that we're in, a few years later. And he says he went down to give speeches and to encourage Yidden to do tshuva. And he says many thousands accepted mitzvahs tefillin, mezuzah, and tzitzis. And then he says, V'chein b'shar artzais hayisi achrach. I went to other lands, not clear which areas he went to. And they asked me, write a Sefer, which is why he wrote Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol, which is 613 mitzvahs. It seems that he didn't know that Rambam had written a Sefer HaMitzvahs. He wrote a Sefer HaMitzvahs. Miyusad, almost Rubai Kekuloi, is Miyusad on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. That's the Sefer that he ended up writing. And for a very long time, this was a very, very popular Sefer in Europe. It was learnt definitely by French Jews and other Jews as well. But what you see over here from this Tkufa is someone coming to Spain and he finds Yidden aren't putting on tefillin. By the way, when the Rebbe initiated Mitzvah Tefillin, the Rebbe pointed to this Smag on a number of occasions as a precedent for the idea that another Yid isn't putting on tefillin, so you have an obligation, go and inspire them. Once, when the Rebbe spoke about this, he said, people, one of the tainas they have a mitzvah tefillin is, you come out to another Jew, you need to have a guf naki in order to tefillin, and you have to have nikius in your mind, physically, but also mentally you have to have nikius. And these people don't have. So the Rebbe said, Moshe of Kutzi in France, when he was encouraging all these thousands of Jews to put on, you think all them mamish had a guf naki in the way you're referring to? Lav dafka, they had a guf naki. And so this was a precedent for this idea. Now we could understand why a Reb Shlomo would be agitated by the Moreh Nevuchim. And we can understand, and we'll hear his voice soon. We didn't hear his voice yet. So far, we only heard people talking about it, but we could understand because it was a real problem. And his defenders here are pointing to the issues and the challenges that were going on in his day. And we can understand why the French rabbis would ban the Moreh Nevuchim based on the things that we're seeing. Alachas kan v'kama, when you realize it's not a book on the shelf, but it's having real life implications. The question is, what about Sefer Hamada? What about Sefer Hamada? None of these, not Rabbi Yosef and not Rabbi Yehuda, they didn't write against Sefer Hamada. In fact, most of the writings that we have from this period, no one really condemned Sefer Hamada, and yet it was part of the Cherem and it was part of the fire. So what happens over here? So really, here we turn back to the Ramban. The Ramban writes to the rabbis in France, and we have his letters. And he basically is trying to make a compromise between the two sides. That's the tone of the Ramban's letter. He wasn't 40 years old. He's in his upper 30s. Later, he's going to be the Gadol Hador. I don't know if he reached that status already yet, but he wrote these letters to the French Rabbanim, and one of the things he says is relevant for us is about Sefer Hamada. And he says, you have tightness on Moreh Nevuchim, I understand you. But ma yoimru l'Sefer Hamada. How do you have any tightness against Sefer Hamada? And here he starts singing the praises of Sefer Hamada. So it's interesting. We just finished Sefer Hamada. What's your highlight? So let's see what the Ramban's highlights are. So he says, number one, he counted the mitzvahs asay, and he counted the mitzvahs lo asay. So the minyan mitzvahs in the beginning is a highlight. Number two, teaching the Talmidim about having kavod and moira and Hilchas Talmud Torah. So Hilchas Talmud Torah is the second highlight. Number three is Hilchas Tshuva. And he goes on to say that we had a problem with Hilchas Tshuva. If you wanted to learn about how to do Tshuva as a Jew before the Rambam, what are you going to do? In the Gemara, it's scattered all over the place, and it's not a guide. And here, for the first time, we have someone who put together a guide on how to do tshuva. These are his highlights of Sefer Hamada, not Hilchos Yesod Torah, not Hilchos Deis. These are his highlights that he's providing. Incidentally, Hilchos Tshuva also happens to be some of the most controversial Perek in Perek Ches. Some of the things we alluded to before and other issues that we're going to talk about soon happen to also be in Hilchos Tshuva. But that's not his focus. His focus here is, look how great Sefer Hamada is. And then he says, what happened? Did you forget about the Ravid? The Ravid, earlier, the Ravid got his copy of the Rambams probably sometime in the late 1100s, 1190s or something like that. And he went through it. He wrote Hasogis. Some of them are very sharp. Some of them are very, very bitter. Some of them very strong disagreements. Fine, no problem. Did he ever say you have to bury the Sefer? Did he ever say you can't read it? Did he ever make a cherem on it? No, he just did his work and that's it. And he never used the words min. He never said that the Rambam is has a tzad minus chas v'shalom. He never did anything like that. So who gives you a right to forget that precedent of the Ravid? The Ravid was a very well respected figure by the Chachmei Tzarfas, and so therefore this is an argument that he's bringing to their attention. In Hilchos Tshuva, when the Rambam writes that Olam Haba is a world of souls without bodies, the Ravid gets pretty close, but it actually proves Ramban's point, because the Ravid says the words of this person Rambam are awfully close. Kroivim, the Lamisha Omer says that Tchias HaMesim is not literal, but is only refers to immortality of the soul. The Ravid didn't say that it is what it is. He just says, "And I Kroivim, it's close," and he didn't cross the line and say, "And therefore this is a work of kfira," or anything like that. He just says, "Chayei Roshi," like Lashon Shvua. This is not the opinion of Chazal. So Ramban basically wants to bring back the good 1990s, the good 1190s. Let's go back to the good 90s when we all got along, when the Rambam was writing, when Ravid was writing these acerbic attacks on the Rambam, but it was within the norm, within the context of a normal base medrash, not what happened here with charamim and burnings and things of the sort. This letter to the Rambam, by the way, doesn't mention any burning, so we have to assume that this letter to the Ramban was written before the burning happened, meaning it's between the cherem and the fire. Okay. Now, so in the next text, I want to show you the Ramban saying, I can't understand what the problem is. It says, maybe this is what your problems are. And he starts listing what the potential problems of Sefer Hamada are. So he says, number one, I heard that you guys maybe don't like Sefer Hamada because he denies Gehenna. Okay, if you learn Hilchos Tshuva Perek Ches, it's all fresh. It's fresh in your mind if you're doing Perek Echad. He doesn't talk about Gehenna. There's not one mention of Gehenna in the entire Sefer. And this is though we have a lot of chapters dealing with a lot of issues and punishment and all that stuff. There's no mention of Gehenna. And in fact, when he talks about punishment, he just mentions karas, being cut off, ceasing to exist, and that's it. And so maybe that's what it is. So the Rambam says, the Ramban says, he comes and defends the Rambam. He says, if you read Hilchos Tshuva really well, you'll notice that in Perek Ches itself, he uses language of people who have passed away and nidoinim al chataseim. They're being punished. And that's, so Rambam does not only say, oh, and the Rasha is cut off, although that is the overarching theme. He does have a few references in Hilchos Tshuva where the person has a chelek lo'olam haba and the person is judged for his sins. So what's that judgment for his sins? So it must mean it's a remez for Gehenna. You have a shaila of why he didn't elaborate on it and why he didn't say clearly. So the Ramban says the reason is because Rambam only likes to talk about the things that he has a clear comprehension of, and the sources are very, very clear about it, and so that's what he's going to talk about. But the inyan of Gehenna is shtickle behelem. We don't have a hechrech and a raya gemura for its existence, and so therefore he chose not to talk about it. But he showed you that he believes in it, and so therefore it's enough, so let go of him. Then he says, another rumor I heard is sha'atem toisim al Sefer Hamada ba'amro she'en lamayla tzura v'tavnis. Maybe your problem is in his statement where he talks about that God has no physical form. So let's talk about this for a minute. In Hilchos Yesod Torah, the Rambam dedicates almost the entire first chapter of Hilchos Yesod Torah to say no physicality, no corporeality whatsoever within God. Ravid leaves him alone there. Ravid doesn't have a problem with that. But then when he comes to Hilchos Tshuva, I don't remember what Perek Gimel, Perek Dalet, something like that, the Rambam says that if you believe that God has any corporeal form, then you're a min. I think he says it's a min. That's what the Ravid says. Whoa, hold on. Many people greater than the Rambam believe that there's some element of physicality to God. And so I think, is that what your issue is? That you don't like that the Rambam wrote that? Here the Rambam says, I'm going to side with the Rambam. Ramban says, I'm going to side with the Rambam. He's right. If that's your problem, he's right. And he says, all the Goyim, this is the traditional Jewish belief. This is what we really believe, that you cannot, he doesn't call it minus, but he calls it hevel. Ramban says, if you believe that there's any sort of physicality to God, that's hevel. And then he does something really wise. He brings a raya from one of theirs, from the Rekeach. The Rekeach lived in Worms. And he wrote a Sefer that is called Shar Yesoid HaYichud VaAmunah. So the Ramban basically knows you can't bring a raya from another Sfardi. It's not going to help. So he brings a raya from Rabbi Elazar of Worms, who everyone there loved in France and in Germany. He had already passed away by then. And he brings from his Sefer very clearly where it says, although there's physical language about God, it's only a metaphor to bring it to you, for you to be able to understand. And so therefore, that shouldn't be an issue. And those are pretty much the only two things that the Rambam brings up, where he says, what's your problem with Sefer Moreh? With Sefer Hamada is the Gehenim issue and the physicality issue. Physicality, he says, Rambam is right. Gehenim issue, he says, don't worry, he put in a remes for Gehenim, leave him alone. I don't understand why you had a problem with Sefer Hamada. Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, we quoted him before, he has a letter on this subject, and he brings another thing that he heard that the Rabbanei Tzarfas were upset about, and that is the inyan of Olam Haba. That my father says that Ein Ba'achila V'lo Shsiya, which means that Olam Haba is souls without bodies, and we know the Ravid disagreed. The Ravid said this is wrong. Ramban himself would, I think later, I don't think he wrote his work by then yet, Shar Agmul, but the Ramban himself strongly disagreed and said Olam Haba is a physical type of existence. Rabbi Avram is saying that he heard that the rabbis in France are upset about this particular issue. Rabbi Avram goes on to defend his father's view. He thinks his father's view is right. There is Moshiach, there is Tchias HaMesim, but that's not the ideal form of existence. The ideal form of existence is Olam Haba, which is souls without bodies. Okay, so these are pretty much, that's all we have. If you want to know what was the problem, you could guess on your own. We could guess on our own. But if you want to look from evidence of that generation where they pointed to problems in Sefer Hamada, that's what we have. The Gehenim issue, the corporeality of God, and the physical nature or not nature of the Olam Haba. Okay. Now, the Ramban decides he wants to try to reach a reconciliation. Again, it seems from his letters this is before any reporting of the fires, because there is no mention of any sort of burning of books in the Ramban's letters, at least not that I noticed. So what does he do? He says as follows. The first thing is he tries to tell the Rabbanim in France, you don't understand your situation, our situation. Do you think, for you, dear Go'inei HaTalmud, the Rambam worked hard to create his Moreh Nevuchim for you guys? He didn't work to create it for you guys. You don't have the challenges that our Jews here have in Spain and the Jews are having in the Middle East, any Jew living in the Islamic world and in Spain had. What was that challenge? The challenge was major exposure to Greek philosophy, which the Ramban details. And nimshachu alavavos acharei Yavanim. People are following the Greek ways. And so the Rambam needed to do something. You need to say something. You need some sort of defense. How do you help these Jews retain their Yiddishkeit and their Judaism if, again, to be woke means Moreh Nevuchim? So it means Greek philosophy. How do you give that person a pathway to Yiddishkeit? So this is what Rambam's motto was. It's a magen hu lechitzai b'nei Yavan. It is a shield against the arrows that are coming from the Greeks. And the people who are drowning in Tita Yavein, he's using that language from Tehillim, using as a pun. Yavein there just means the deep mud that a person's getting stuck in. He's using it as a pun for Yavan in terms of Greek philosophy. And so therefore the Ramban goes on to say, you have to rescind your ban, take your cherem away. Here's what we could do. Here's the middle ground. We could make a ban on making what he calls is issuing explanations to the Moreh. In other words, there's the problem of when you take the Moreh Nevuchim, it says what it says. Then there's the expansion. And so therefore say, where are new areas this applies and whatever. So we could ban that. And on also doing pirsum. Pirsum means like mass marketing campaigns to get people to come learn Moreh Nevuchim. That type of thing, you could put maybe a ban against that. But to tell people, Jews in Spain who need this and who are doing this, and he says, by the way, they're not going to listen to you even if you don't rescind the ban, they're going to continue. You got to rescind the ban, take it away, let them learn their Moreh Nevuchim. I disagree with many things in Moreh Nevuchim, and indeed Ramban in his Pirush al Torah attacks the Rambam numerous times, but he's not willing to cross the line that we should go to a ban. He wants to leave it without a ban, and this is a letter that the Rambam writes to the Chachmei Tzarfas. Okay, good. What eventually happens? The ban is taka lifted. And so now, let's go back to the beginning. Beginning, we heard all these voices about the story. But there's a key voice we didn't get to hear yet. And that's the voice of Reb Shlomo. And I mentioned before that he's mentioned very respectfully by his contemporaries, the Ramban and others. And we have one document from Reb Shlomo. He wrote a letter into Spain that was preserved. Let's read what he says about this. It's going to become very clear this letter is before any fire happened. There is no mention of any burning. But it's after the rabbis in France made a chedem. Let's see why he did what he did and what he did from his letter. About the fighting that's going on in our community here in Montpellier. Let me tell you, we have newcomers here, who are eradicating our tradition. They're turning it into a mashal, ma'aseh bereishis. In other words, they're taking the whole story of creation, they're saying it's a mashal, we saw that before, and told us Cain v'Hevel, and the story of Cain v'Hevel, the story of the people who live very long, right? Also, it's all a mashal. And they're doing the same thing. We also heard from a translator, it's unknown who he's referring to here, one of the translators, who revealed everything that Rambam concealed. In other words, here's another critique in this whole process was, Rambam wrote it in Arabic. Who gave you a right to translate it into Hebrew? First of all, in your translation, maybe you're changing something, and number two, you're bringing mass exposure. But in addition to that, he says, we heard this person say, every story in the Torah is a mashal. And every mitzvah is just hanhagas, just behaviors. In other words, you don't have to take a mitzvah seriously, chas v'shalom. When I heard this, I became really, really upset. Rabbis had many debates with them. And then what happened is, I didn't start up. They started up. They slandered, and they said that I slandered the Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe. And this never happened. I never said anything against the Rambam. I never did any ad hominem attacks against him. And then when I saw Kichol Sa'ara, I saw that I'm in trouble. I'm like, okay, let me bring the rabbis from France here. In other words, he was looking for support. Why? What did I want from them? To comfort us, and to speak to us, and to strengthen us. They're going to tell us, send a memo. What is the true Judaism look like? What is Torah really? What are mitzvahs? That's what I was looking for, that type of support. When my letter reached them, they also got shooken up. And Gamigi Aleim Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, and Mamish at this time, somehow they get the Moreh Nevuchim. V'chara apamoid, and they get very upset. And so they girded themselves to take their swords out and to take their curses out. In other words, they're the ones who issued the cherem, which we already know. Everyone's shocked by this cherem. I'm also surprised. I also don't think it's warranted. I also didn't ask for it. I'm not interested in it. But this is something that they do. And then he goes on the next paragraph to swear. I never spoke foul on the Rambam. And he says, we quote him all the time. In fact, we try to defend the Rambam's words. And then he says, it's very possible that what's going on is that you have someone going on in your community, it seems he's referring to the Radak, who I mentioned before, was in Spain at this time, trying to get support against Reb Shlomo. He said, you should be aware that there's a letter going around that is presumably my writing to the rabbis in France. I'm letting you know it's forged. I didn't write that. Because that letter says I'm asking for a cherem, and that letter has me attacking the Rambam. I never wrote that. Someone forged that, and so please look into that before you reach any conclusion. And he signs his letter Shlomo bar Avram, and it's also signed by Reb David, who's the other name, one of the names of his two students that we saw earlier. So what do we see here? We see Reb Shlomo basically is corroborating what we saw before. There was a sociological problem. And it was linked to the Rambam's writing, specifically, mostly to the Moreh Nevuchim. And this bothered him. And he decided he was going to do something about it. And he did turn to the rabbis in France. But that's it. He wasn't interested in the Cherem. And the Cherem came, presumably he wanted it off. So he must have been happy with Ramban's approach. Ramban's approach would seem to... Ramban also was unhappy about the Moreh Nevuchim. Ramban also wanted to limit the Moreh Nevuchim. So the Ramban's approach seems very close to Reb Shlomo's approach. Now, if this is the case, now you have to go back to Radak's testimony. And Radak says that Reb Shlomo went to the Christians and said, burn the book. Now, it's important to know, Radak wasn't there. He wasn't in Montpellier. Everything he's hearing from other sources. He's in Spain during this whole parsha. And we know that Reb Shlomo is saying he has enemies. He has enemies in Montpellier who are forging documents in his name. So in other words, those people who are forging documents are also forging narratives and stories. So we have a possibility over here that this story that Radak had, and in good faith perhaps shared it with others, but it's very possible that it's not accurate. Think about it. If Reb Shlomo, if we're going to take him here at his word, and why not? Why wouldn't you take someone who all the scholars of their generation said was an upright man and a great Talmid Chacham and a tzaddik? Why shouldn't we take him at his word here? So if you're going to take him at his word, he's saying, I didn't even ask for a French ban. If you didn't ask for a French ban, you think he's going to go to the Christians and say, come take our books from us, come make an investigation? That's 100 times worse. Mesira was the worst crime, as I said, a person could do then. And even though he was on a religious war, and sometimes you say people go on a religious war, they end up doing things that maybe they themselves would regret later. But again, if he himself didn't ask for a cherem, then it's very hard for me to believe that he himself asked for the books to be burnt. And there's more supporting evidence for this. The Meiri was a big admirer of the Rambam. The Meiri lived after this. He was a big admirer of the Rambam, lived in Provence. So the Meiri quotes this Reb Shlomo and calls him Doilei HaChachamim. Do you really think that he would call him Doilei HaChachamim if he went to the Franciscans and the Dominicans and said, come take our books? Very hard to believe that. And in fact, there are other accounts that are written saying that Jews went and said, take these books from us, and then do not specify their names. And do not specify the names. And in fact, the defender, Rabbi Yosef ben Tadras Halevi, who was a defender who we saw before, he criticizes Reb Shlomo. And he says Reb Shlomo's approach was wrong because you need to talk delicate, you need to talk soft, you need to talk inspiring words. You can't criticize harshly if you want to inspire people to do tshuva. And so in that regard, he criticizes Reb Shlomo. But then when he talks about the burning, his lashon is, Ad shenis galgulu hadvarim l'sreifas hasefer hazeh ayidei hakoimrim. He's very careful in his language to say, Nizgalgal advarim, things happen, one thing led to next, and they burnt it. He does not take the burning and put it in the zone of Reb Shlomo. So in other words, yes, is it possible that Reb Shlomo did it? It's possible. But there's also another possibility. The other possibility is that anytime you have a machlokes, anytime you have a dispute, there are always multiple layers to it. And there's always the philosophically minded people or the people who have like the dispute on an academic level. And then there's always, when something spills into the street, there's always the side of it where it's just completely personal. It's just completely, I need a win. And it's not about ideology at all. It's just, I'm with you, whatever you do is right, whatever the other person is doing, very, very black and white type of thing. We see this all the time when we see in the world of politics, for example. So it's not upgefrekt that you had other Jews who did go over to the Christian side and did do this. That itself is not clear. We don't know. It is also possible, by the way, that no Jew went over to the Christian side. Is it possible that the Christian community hears that something's going on, they say, let's take a look at this, and then they on their own decide to act? That's also possible. There is no clear evidence. There is no voice in Montpellier who's neutral, most of the voices aren't neutral. But almost all the voices aren't even there talking about this fire. So it's really it's something that's actually shrouded in mystery. I said before, we don't know how many copies were burnt. We don't know where this fire took place, presumably in Montpellier. But beyond that, we don't really have information. And now I'm saying we don't really know how it happened. Nizgalgalu hadvarim l'sreifas hasefer hazeh is the words that Rabbi Yosef ben Tadras Halevi, who defends Reb Shlomo, says. You have to assume Reb Shlomo would say that about himself as well. There's another factor to consider in all this, and that is there are multiple accounts that say that after they burnt the Rambam, the Christians did an investigation further and found out that there was false testimony. What did they do in Provence if you gave false testimony in the 1230s? One of the punishments that was very common was to remove the tongue of the person who issued this false testimony. And they say that that's what happened here. Now guess what? Rabbeinu Yoina, who's one of the three who's mentioned in this whole story, a few years later became the Rav and the Darshan in Toledo, in Spain. So presumably he had his tongue. It's very hard to be a Darshan when you don't have your tongue. It's a very hard thing to imagine that these very well-known figures, Reb Shlomo, Reb Yoina, we pretty much know they had their tongues. And so this is another factor to consider in this discussion, that indeed it wasn't Reb Shlomo who's telling it. But the main thing is his voice. You see his voice here saying, I wasn't for the Cherem, and if he isn't for the Cherem, he definitely isn't for the book burning. Okay, now what's the end of the story? The end of the story is that there is a book burning of the Gemara a few years later. There were those who were very pro-Rambam who decided to connect the two. So you know why the Gemara was burnt in Paris on Erech 1242? We gave a share on it last summer. You know why that happened? Oh, because you burnt the Rambam. Hashem was upset, and this is the punishment. Okay, fine. That happens sometimes when people see, they give a theological explanation. On a very historical level, there's no connection between these two incidents. But then, what happens after that is that the dispute moves right back to where it was before. That it's not on the streets, it's not cherem, it's not fires, but it is a dispute that in some ways remains with us till this day. And that is the role of Chachmas Chisonis, the role of secular knowledge, navigating that together with Judaism. What role does Moreh Nevuchim play in Jewish life? What role should it play in Jewish life? How to deal with the controversial passages that are there? That's an ongoing discussion that we need to have, and that maybe we will follow up in a separate shiur. Now let's reach the time for the conclusion. So reach the conclusion running a little late. So we'll summarize with a few points, about 4 or 5 points, and we'll conclude. Number one, there's a letter from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe wrote a letter sometime in the 1790s where there was a book, presumably Tzavos Rivash, the Torahs of the Baal Shem Tov, and it was burnt in Vilna. And the Hasidim in Vilna were very shocked and horrified by this. And they wrote to the Alter Rebbe that they want to take Nekama. And the Alter Rebbe wanted to calm them down and said, don't worry about it, it's going to be fine. And they're like, what do you mean it's going to be fine? They burnt our book! So the Alter Rebbe wrote back at the end of this long letter, and he said, don't worry, look what happened with the Rambam. The people, and he stresses it like this. He gives a summary of the story, and you could actually do a lot of ha'aris on the specifics that the Alter Rebbe talks about, which we're not going to do. I'll focus on the main theme of the letter. The main theme of the letter is who had an issue with the Rambam as a person. Which, the truth is, we didn't really see that today. We didn't see anyone having an issue with the Rambam as a person. But it did exist. In previous decades, before the 1230s, there were people who mamish attacked the Rambam and weren't even dan him lekaf schos. And that's presumably who the Alter Rebbe is talking about. They say, why did they attack him as a person? Because they didn't know him. They didn't know him, they thought he was a kofer, and they didn't understand things properly. And what happened at the end? The truth came out, and look, the Rambam is accepted by everyone. Same thing, he says, is going to happen with us. It's the people who don't know us who hate us. As people learn more about us, they won't hate us anymore, and then you'll see Hasidus is going to take over the world. So that's the statement that the Alter Rebbe said, leaning into this story and taking encouragement from it. So really, you could say that right there is an important lesson. This whole story is an important lesson. When the going is tough, to remember, it was pretty tough for the Rambam throughout it, and yet he came out with shining colors. In some ways, if you're not controversial, it also means maybe you're not doing enough. Maybe you're not doing enough good. So that's just a way to look at controversy and look at a difficult situation, to remember that you can come out on the strong side. That's number one. Number two, personally, I very much connected with the whole way of, on the one hand, strongly criticizing at least sections of the Rambam and criticizing maybe the fact that he wrote it. He shouldn't have written it, and he shouldn't have included certain passages, but at the same time saying, but you know something? He's a tzaddik, he's a wonderful man. We need that in our lives, because the natural tendencies when you see someone making an error is to then just turn them into one big rotten ball and to say that person is terrible and has no redeeming qualities, and then that's it. It is a gift to be able to say, you're a good person, you're a special person, I cherish you and I love you, and yet I strongly and vehemently disagree with something that you did. That's a talent that we need to work on as a community to develop. So that's another important lesson to take from here. Obviously, the cheshivos of learning Mishnah Torah. The words that the Ramban used over here is, how dare you criticize the Yad? How dare you criticize the Mishnah Torah? Kulam avulai v'chazubai upaschai v'ein soiger. Everyone desires it, looks at it, opens it, and can't close it. So Pashat, that was then the Ramban saying. That's obviously very important for us today as we move on into the next Sefer of the Rambam. And finally, there's one more point to come back to the Nakudah of Gimel Tammuz. Sorry, I'm going a little over, but it's the shir before Gimel Tammuz, so I'm going to give myself permission. Mentioned earlier, Shemesh Begivin Doim, the first critique that we saw against Moreh Nevuchim was his words about Shemesh Begivin Doim. So what's interesting is the following. It happened Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz is the day the Frierdiker Rebbe was partially released from prison in 1927. The Rebbe asked a question about the Frierdiker Rebbe's release. If a miracle happened that the Frierdiker Rebbe is released, why not straight to Yud Beis Tammuz? Why is it that you go to Gimel Tammuz? It's a process. Oh, first, okay, no death sentence, but we're going to send you to Galus. And then 10 days later, oh, okay, by the way, we're going to free you. Why that process if there's a miracle? And really, you could ask the same question about the story of Shemesh Begivin Doim. God's making a miracle? Make a miracle that the Amorim disappear. Whoosh! No. The Jews are still going to have to fight their battle, and they're going to still have to take their swords out, and they're still going to have to sweat and tears and blood and all of that, but I'm going to make this miracle? What's going on over here? And there's a third similar question in Parshas Koirach, this week's Parsha, about the stick. Because when Hashem makes the miracle that the stick buds to prove that Aaron is the true Kohen, it doesn't just come out with fruits which Shkedim. There's a flower, a leaf, and a bud, and a thing. Through the whole process, it's just expedited. But why go through the whole process? So you have the same theme in all three stories. What's the theme in all three stories? That as much as there's going to be a miracle, we're not negating Teva. It's something the Rambam cared a lot about, incidentally. Teva matters, and we shouldn't do away with it. And you see that even in these miracles, no, you're going to have to fight the war. I'll hold the sun out, but you're going to have to fight the war. I'll expedite the process, but the way this almond grows, it's going to take its natural course. And likewise, a geula for a Rebbe is going to come about in such a way where first they're going to send him to exile, then they realize, you know something, we might as well free him, because Teva matters. And a miracle has to be compatible with Teva, because that's the Jew's mission in life, is to bring the miracle, spirituality, alikus, and godliness into a world of Teva, not to run away from Teva. We're not trying to run away from nature. And avoida, what does that mean? The Rebbe says in the Sikha, this is a Sikha of Gimel Tammuz, Shin, Nun Aleph, what's that in avoida? That we want to hold on to our Teva. You want to hold on to your koiches, your talents, your chushim, your nature. We don't want to run away from that. We want to hold that. But at the same time, we want to take the deep, deep miracle within you. The miracle within you is the soul, the neshama, the Mesiras Nefesh that a Jew has. We want to take the miracle within you and we want that to influence your individuality. You're not running away from it. It's easy to run away from it and say, I'm Mesiras Nefesh, I'm a Munah, let me run away from my characteristics of a human being. No. The story of Shemesh Begivin Doim, the story of Koirach, the story of Gimel Tammuz, all teach us the idea that we need to take the highest and connect it with the lowest. Taking the deepest powers of the neshama and linking it with our characteristics in Teva. Okay, now let's make the Siyum Rambam brief, quickly.